If you're actively trying to run a country or trying to overthrow those who are, you're currently watching the right video. As you know by now, it's a real hassle trying to get the commoners on your side. Coercing large groups of people to agree with your political standings is a difficult task.
This guy stinks!
Throughout history, the ruling class have had their hands full trying to find new ways to put an end to mass protests, drum up support for a definitely justified military effort, or simply sway the collective conscience of the population into a more nationalistic kind of mindset. Historically, this has been done in several ways. By force,
You shut the f*** up!
with funny little posters, by more force, and perhaps unexpectedly, with the art of music. Music has long been a surprisingly helpful tool in the arsenal of every dictator and aspiring revolutionary. But you might be wondering, how do I create the perfect propaganda music? Well, here at the Candid Jam Ministry of Truth, we've distilled everything you need to know into an easy-to-follow 4-step guide. But first, what are we talking about when we use the term propaganda music? Well, the term propaganda is one we hear thrown around a lot these days, and depending on who you ask, you may get a different answer. For the sake of this video, we're going with the Cambridge Dictionary definition. So with that in mind, let's get into it. To separate the music that might get the population to salute at a football game from the music that will get every male inside your borders to fly to another continent to spread the good word of democratic freedoms and McDonald's, the first place to start is with music theory. It's important that we know how to make music with intrinsic values that inspire our population, make them proud of their country, and most importantly, cast away any moral hang-ups that they may have with your cause. This idea goes all the way back to ancient Greece with a man named Plato, who was writing about another man named Socrates. Plato's Republic is a dialogue about a group of fellas discussing what the ingredients are for the perfect city-state. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of the Joe Rogan podcast. Among these discussions came the topic of music. What music would breed the best leaders? And it went a little something like this. Nah, dude, trust me. I really think you gotta only have music that makes people want to go to war against the Persian Empire. That seems kind of excessive, dude. Like, what about music that's like just chilled? Nah, you gotta ban it. Dude, ban anything that's not written in Dorian or Phrygian scales. What about like Lydian or Ionian? Like, they're pretty relaxing. Relaxing? These are not the qualities of warlike men. Dude, what about like the instrument makers who like make harps that aren't in Dorian or like Phrygian? Well, you gotta kill them.
Can't say that.
Dude, we're gonna get cancelled, man. So what can we learn from this? Well, it's obvious that when writing a propaganda song, the melodies and harmonies need to be specifically crafted to inspire, and sometimes even incite fear into the listener. Basically, stick to the strong and reliable scales. A good way to project a sense of unison among your followers is to duplicate melodies with different octaves and instruments. That way, when listeners hear the cries of an orchestral chorus doubling up with the piercing bellows of a brass section, it makes the song feel a lot more grand and powerful, like everyone's working together, just like they should be. This is a common trait among national anthems, most of which barely feature any harmonic nuance and rely solely on a strong melody across their entire instrumentation. As far as rhythm goes, if you're trying to project stability, you better have your music doing the same. There's a reason why jazz could never make good propaganda music. I mean, it's complete anarchy. As such, projecting a strong and stable political idea is done with a steady, marching beat. But to truly understand the profound effects that strong melodies can have on one's populace, we must go to the opera. More specifically, the opera in the former USSR. The year is 1936, better known as the worst time to be doing anything other than burying yourself underground in preparation for the years to come. But even in a world slowly tilting into chaos, some still hold ambition to see their name up in lights. Among those is a 30-year-old Dmitri Shostakovich. He's already being hailed as one of the best young composers coming out of the Soviet Union. He's touring around the country with his new opera, titled Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. Now, this isn't your grandma's kind of opera. It's a bit raunchy. It follows the story of a woman who cheats on her husband, kills him and her father-in-law, and then is sent to die in a Siberian gulag. Although the public quite liked the show, there was only one man that Shostakovich and many other artists in the Soviet Union cared about impressing: Joseph Stalin. Much like his friend to the east, Stalin never underestimated the effects that art and music could have on his population. As such, Stalin regularly found himself at the opera, watching to ensure that composers were writing music that upheld his cultural values. And on a fateful night in 1936, Shostakovich would look up to one of the boxes in Russia's iconic Bolshoi theatre to see the big man himself preparing to watch his show. Being something of a patriot himself, Shostakovich was filled with a nervous excitement. If Stalin approved of his show, it would be the highest honor he could achieve. If he disapproved, he could end up in the gulag himself. He was shocked when partway through his show, he looked up at Stalin's seat to see he had left. Sure enough, a few days later, the state-owned paper featured an anonymous article destroying his show. The article labelled the show as primitive and vulgar, that it tickles the perverted taste of the bourgeoisie, and that it was little more than a wilderness of musical chaos. The article was rumoured to be written by Stalin himself, and although this is pretty unlikely, it's certain that he at least approved of it. The show dwindled in popularity following the article, and Shostakovich lived his life in constant fear of facing Stalin's wrath. But he didn't give up composing. In fact, he committed to a full-on redemption arc. Long story short, in the coming years he wrote another symphony that was once again shot down by the authorities. The government killed off a bunch of people he was working with, and his time was running out. But then, he completed his 5th symphony. It's not unlikely that this was the last shot he had at redemption, so he had to make it count. Nearly 2 years after his abysmal failure in Leningrad, he returned to unveil his new masterpiece, and it was an undeniable success. The symphony, specifically the 4th and final movement, carries such an aura of strength and triumph, blending both major and minor keys, allowing for powerful melodies. With parts featuring a heavy marching rhythm that's carried by a timpani drum. The piece drew from great Russian composers of the past, evoking the sense of nationalistic pride that Stalin craved in his art. This wasn't just a symphony, it was a patriotic anthem. Attendees teared up as the finale came to a close, and although Stalin wasn't there to see it, the authorities thought it to be so good that it restored Shostakovich's career and honor. This shows how important music theory is to propaganda. Make the right musical decisions, and you can instill such a pride in the listener that they might not see any problem at all with invading Poland. This was probably obvious, but most of what will make your propaganda music effective is buried within the song's lyrical content. This is where you can really be creative. The lyrics can be as blatantly on the nose as possible. My personal favourite example of hilariously straightforward lyric writing comes from American country musician Lee Greenwood with his magnum opus, God Bless the USA. So the story behind this song is pretty insane to begin with. Greenwood released the song originally in 1984, and it almost instantly became a patriotic anthem. The song was featured in a film about then President Ronald Reagan, not to be confused with a film starring then President Ronald Reagan.
Well.
Following that, the song was closely associated with the Republican Party. Greenwood performed the song at the 1988 Republican National Convention, at a bunch of George Bush's rallies, and it even featured in a few of George Bush's TV advertisements. But as it turns out, being a patriotic country singer is a lot like being a weapons manufacturer. And by that, I mean war is great for business. When the Gulf War started in 1990, the song suddenly got popular again. Now, there's not really any evidence to support the claim that this sudden rise in popularity was a result of the government forcing it onto the radio more, but let's assume that at the very least, they were happy the song was popular again. And so was Greenwood, so much so that he re-recorded the song for his 1992 album, American Patriot. Just under 10 years later, Greenwood saw dollar signs again on the day of September 11th, shortly after which he re-released the song once more, allowing it to peak at number 16 on the Billboard pop charts. For the 3rd time, the song was a hit. There was even a kids bop version by a Christian pop group called Jump 5, so even the kiddies could get fired up about firing up Bin Laden. Anyway, the lyrics of this song leave nothing to interpretation. Greenwood's triumphant singing echoes the sentiment of being proud of his country, being happy to protect it at all costs, even though he never actually served in a war. These lyrics are simple and catchy. They're so generic that they could literally apply to any country, which is something that Greenwood realized in 1989 when he fucking re-released the song again, but changed it to be about Canada.
God bless you, Canada.
What? There it is. It's the exact same song. He just changed the verses where he mentions locations. And even then, one of them is the same. For fuck's sakes, he didn't even change the chorus to make it rhyme with Canada. Is this not treason? This feels like it should be treason. What was I talking about again? That's the key. Simple, repetitive lyrics. Greenwood's track also does a good job at painting a picture of a beautiful and diverse nation, and everything that the listener has to be proud of, and more importantly, what they should want to protect. You can see that having imagery in your lyrics is important. So when writing your lyrics, think of it like painting a picture of what your country should look like. Depict strong, brave men, a beautiful and unique landscape, or a thriving first world civilization. It's important to take into consideration when and how your propaganda music is being delivered. Choosing the right time to drop your new politically charged heat is imperative to making sure that it has the desired effect. But it wouldn't be a YouTube video about propaganda without talking about the single most over-documented country of all time, North Korea. Quick little North Korean history lesson here. In 2013, 2 years after the death of his father Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong Un ordered the abrupt execution of one of his key policy advisors, who was also his uncle, Song Yang-thaek. Yang was one of the most powerful people in North Korea around the time of Kim Jong-il's death, so much so that some academics believed him to be the de facto ruler of the country as the former supreme leader was in his dying days. But the succession of power didn't quite go his way, with Kim Jong-un taking his father's place as the country's leader. Fast forward a few years, and Yang was accused of anti-party and counter-revolutionary acts, which he was later executed for. The government made extreme efforts to gaslight the population into thinking that the guy never even existed. They even cropped him out of rebroadcast television footage. But Kim thought he had to go a step further. He needed to clear the air of a sense of party destabilization and remind the people who they should really be thinking about. And he did that with an absolute tune. This is a song titled We Will Follow Only You, Kim Jong-un. Really subtle title there, guys. Around this time, it was reportedly required to be sung in factories and schools around the country. In this live performance, you can see the crowd absolutely going off. Also, just some quick advice for any aspiring political dictators out there. If you've crafted a song to distract your people from the fact that you had a key political advisor killed by a firing squad, it's probably best to leave out the footage of you wielding a pistol. This song serves as a good example of a leader choosing to release their propaganda song at the perfect time. Your song can have direct effects on something that's happening in real time, and North Korea understands this quite well. They drop state-sanctioned tunes for all occasions. They dropped this tune just so the population would start eating more potatoes. Another good example of a piece of music being dropped at the perfect time can be seen in George Cohen's World War I anthem, Over There. You see, modern propaganda has its roots in war. It was the First World War that ushered in the age of mass propaganda. Public relations experts like Edward Bernays learnt to master the art of influencing public opinion. To gain public approval for joining a war that, until now, the country wanted very little to do with, the first ever large-scale propaganda operation was sanctioned. Although most of these efforts were focused on other media formats like graphic, easy-to-understand posters, it was around this time that George M. Cohen, a playwright once referred to as the man who owned Broadway, saw a newspaper on his way into work. When he saw that America was on their way to Europe, Cohen got to work. He wrote the song Over There as a call to action for the American people, with lyrics such as, "The Yanks are coming, so prepare, say a prayer." The song was an absolute hit. By the end of the war, it had sold over 2 million copies of sheet music. The song had become a widespread inspiration for America to contribute to the war effort. He was given the Congressional Gold Medal from President Roosevelt a few years later in recognition of what his patriotic anthem symbolized for both the civilians and soldiers. The song is blatantly obvious with what it's trying to achieve. It unapologetically calls for Americans to support their involvement in the war. However, the same can't be said for other songs. Using music as a means to change public opinion on going to war didn't end with Over There. For years to come, most countries have had catalogues of pro-war folk songs detailing their drive to invade other nations. A more recent example comes from America once again with Daryl Worley's song Have You Forgotten, a song which attempts to disguise itself as a tribute to the victims of September 11th whilst just being a pro-Afghan war country song. Dissecting the lyrics of this song provides an absolute masterclass in propaganda music making. Worley jumps straight onto the offensive, telling the listener right out the gates that it's time for war, baby. However, this message is carefully woven in with lyrics focusing more on paying tribute to and remembering those who died in the attacks. The song's not-so-subtle lyrics aim to make the listener feel as though in order to pay respects to the victims of the attack, they have to also support going to war in Afghanistan. You may not be surprised, but this song did spark some controversy. LA Times writer Geoff Boucher described the song as a pro-war call to action, and that sentiment was shared among other critics. Worley responded to such criticisms by claiming the song is pro-America, it's pro-military, but I don't necessarily think that it's a pro-war song, which is kind of strange when you actually consider what he's saying in these lyrics. Worley later claimed, the song is posing a question. Have you forgotten about what happened to our country on 9/11? That's pretty much the size of it. And that would be true if you shaved off about 75% of the song's lyrics that are clearly not just reflecting on the grief of the country, but are adamantly propagating for invasion of the Middle East. But this is where it gets pretty interesting. Worley officially released the song as a recording in March 2003, 2 months after he first performed the song in January of that year. What raised eyebrows for some was that between the live performance and the official single release, Worley changed one of his lyrics, where in the live performance he sung "Don't You Tell Me Not to Worry About Bin Laden." In the recorded version, it was changed to "We Vowed to Get the Ones Behind Bin Laden." This subtle shift in wording implied a different message, as the USA was getting ready for the invasion of Iraq. Now, I'm not about to get into the entire history behind America's involvement in the Middle East, so here's the TLDR. Afghanistan and Iraq are not the same country. Despite this, the Bush administration made pretty significant and ill-founded attempts to conflate the war in Afghanistan, which was justified as retaliation to 9/11, with the war in Iraq, which had nothing to do with it. This was all bundled into what was sold to the American people as the war on terror.
We must stop the terror. Now watch this drive.
As such, the subtle change in lyrics from Worley kind of supported the Bush administration's false accusations that Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda had a secretive relationship. So when Worley changed the lyrics to getting the ones behind bin Laden and not just bin Laden himself, in the context of everything else going on at the time, it seems this was done intentionally to shift the focus from just being on bin Laden to the wider war on terror. Now, we may never know if this was Worley's idea or if this change was a result of conversations with the powers that be. Either way, the change is a display of how propaganda music can sit on the pulse of current events and at least attempt to influence public opinion in real time. This one might be easy to overlook, but if there's one thing we've learned in this video so far, it's that music acts as a medium for sharing ideas. Now, this is great when it's sharing your ideas, but what about when it's not? Well, if you're in a position of power, there's a rather easy solution for this. You make sure no musicians have a platform for sharing music with opposing ideas to yours. There's a few ways you can do this, but the easiest one is to just neutralize anyone with an acoustic guitar and a bit of disobedience. One such example of this is the tragic story of Victor Jara. Jara was a Chilean singer-songwriter during the coup of 1973, where the democratically elected Allende government was overthrown by the brutal and US-backed Augusto Pinochet. Jara was a well-known communist and supported the previous Allende government from the beginning, playing free shows at his political rallies and even writing the song "We Will Triumph," which became the theme song of Allende's supporters. As such, when Pinochet took over, Jara was captured, sent to a makeshift detention center where he was tortured and later assassinated. Now, this kind of thing isn't uncommon for military dictatorships, but why risk all that blood on your hands? In fact, the most effective way of banning anti-government music is ensuring it's never even created in the first place. If only someone could explain a better way to enforce such a rule. I don't know, maybe someone in a band, maybe some kind of explainer, maybe some kind of bandsplainer?
Aw, thank you, Candid Jam. So as my colleague was saying, there are actually many countries that impose limits on foreign music as a way of promoting local bands and bolstering a national identity. Canada, for example, still requires radio stations to play domestic artists at least 35% of the time, as does Australia, France, and frankly, most of the world. There are also more extreme examples of foreign genres being banned entirely, such as jazz records getting burned in post-war Poland, music academies being shuttered in Cultural Revolution-era China, or Islamic fundamentalist regimes that just don't want girls to have any fun. But while all of these would make for a compelling story, there's a different example I'm going to share with you today. It's the story of a pretty brutal dictatorship that also kind of worked. I mean, musically, at least. The banning of all foreign music led to a revolutionary new sound. I'm talking about the country of Guinea. So, a little background first. Guinea was a colony of France, and as such, it had many vestiges of French culture. Musical groups in the capital catered to the French elite, playing jazz, waltz, and other ballroom dances. Now, after independence, Guinea's first leader, Sékou Touré, was no fan of his former colonizer, the guys who had both literally and metaphorically enslaved the nation. It didn't help either that France basically scorched the place on the way out, ripping out any infrastructure of value, ensuring the country would be disadvantaged for decades. So what did Touré do on day one in office? Naturally, he banned all foreign genres from the radio. Touré disbanded all existing music groups, and in their place created a network of government-sponsored orchestras. Each were called upon to explore the traditional music of their region, while also maybe incorporating some of his political messages for good measure. So, did it work? Well, if the interests of music collectors are any sort of barometer, the answer is a resounding yes. Guinea would become an extremely fertile ground for new and exciting music. In particular, a range of traditional sounds were amplified, fused with electric guitar, brass horns, and infectious rhythms. Many records from Guinea's national xylophone record label are considered legendary by collectors today, such as those from Bembea Jazz. And it has inspired music from many other regions across Africa. At my channel, Bandsplaining, we actually have a whole other video discussing these records. You guys think Mr. Candid will mind if I drop this link here? I'm gonna do it. Just don't tell him. And as for Mr. Touré, his regime may have been a success musically, but as far as human rights are concerned, that's a whole other story. If any other dictators are watching, I wouldn't recommend repeating his methods.
So there you have it. Follow this guide to a T, and you'll probably never have to worry about the longevity of your leadership. Regularly dropping some hard mixtapes on your citizens will ensure that they're too busy vibing out to ever question why they're letting you lead in the first place. So, there you go. You're welcome.